Bird and Wildlife Monitoring, Integrating Proven Methods and New Technology to Monitor Wildlife. The Earth is seeing the greatest decline in biodiversity in recorded history. And according to a recent report, North America has lost 1/4 of all birds over the past 50 years. However, there are organizations monitoring these declines and working hard to reverse these trends. Birds Canada is one example. It is the leader in monitoring bird populations throughout Canada and works with various partners to ensure habitat remains for birds and other wildlife. Ian Fife will discuss a variety of practical methods commonly applied to wildlife for environmental monitoring. This will include the capture and safe release of birds and other wildlife species, as well as methods used to monitor bird populations and their habitats. He will also discuss the actions taken to protect or improve habitat based on the data collected through monitoring effects, as well as the importance of working with landowners and partners that live and work in a bird habitat. Finally, Ian will show you how everyone can help monitor wildlife through phone apps and volunteers and citizen science opportunities. So a little bit about our guest speaker. Ian Fife is a bird ecologist and is the Ontario Forest Birds at Risk Program Coordinator for Birds Canada. He earned his master's degree at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. His thesis measured the direct effects of bird nests and their population from forest activity. During his 15 years of field experience, he has worked primarily with birds throughout North America in ecosystems ranging from prairies to the Arctic to the Carolinian forest in southern Ontario. In Ian's current position, he monitors populations of 4 of Canada's most at-risk bird species in the Carolinian forest region. He also measures key aspects of bird habitat to help maintain suitable bird habitat across the study area. Through rigorous scientific population and habitat monitoring, as well as building partnerships, Ontario Forest Birds at Risk program aims to increase the population and habitat for these 4 bird species. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Ian Fife, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks Diana for the introduction. Hope everybody can see my screen and can hear me okay. All right, here we go. So again, thank you. Thank you all for joining in this webinar. I hope you will find it informative. So I would like to begin this presentation off with a quick public service announcement. So some people are sensitive to wildlife trapping, and there are photos and videos in this presentation that show trapped and handled animals. While the animals in each of these scenarios may be stressed, in no way are they harmed. The #1 priority for all wildlife and wildlife researchers is the animal's safety. So for me and everyone that I have ever worked with, the most important objective above and beyond collecting data is animal welfare. In every case of live trapping, there should always be someone watching over the animals, and this is usually a vet or a highly experienced individual, depending on the type of research being done. So if we feel a trapped animal's health is in jeopardy, the animal is immediately removed from the situation to recover and released, or it's immediately released to ensure they are released safely and injury-free. So with that said, I'll begin my discussion by providing a brief overview of wildlife ecology, conservation, and population management, because if we don't understand why it's important, we can't really begin to understand why we should be doing it. I'll move on to the old and new methodologies used for monitoring and measuring wildlife and their habitat, and how newer technology is advancing our understanding of wildlife. So there are entire university and college courses on the different methods used to measure wildlife populations. It would be near impossible to cover everything in a 45-minute presentation. So I will discuss some of the more common and standardized methods used in wildlife research. I'll introduce a brief discussion about citizen science and the technology that comes along with that. And to finish it off, I'll speak briefly about how the information we collect at Birds Canada is being applied to protect and improve bird habitat for the endangered cerulean warbler. All right, so we'll start off here. So I'd like to cover a basic background of wildlife ecology. I've kind of already said this, but so we want to understand why we are studying wildlife in the first place. As in all sciences, everything starts with a question to try and understand the environment around us. Ecology is the study of wildlife interactions with one another and their surrounding environment. So it has been around since the mid-1800s, where the focus is primarily on wildlife populations. There have since been numerous theories and disciplines identified, but today we'll broadly discuss population growth and regulation as it is the driving force behind most wildlife research. I would like to make a quick note about the theory behind diversity and diverse ecosystems. The importance of diversity has only been around for about 20 to 30 years. It's still relatively new. It poses many important questions, important and controversial questions. For example, what is more important? Should we be protecting one species at risk, or should we be protecting many species with a diverse ecosystem? So the first fundamental, there are three fundamental areas of wildlife ecology. The first one I'd like to talk about is habitat selection and use. And this encompasses a wide range of topics, but essentially it refers to the species' behavior within their habitat. And it can include their dispersal and distribution as well as their food and nutrition and their diet selection. So for example, the graphic here is showing different types of wildlife movement within their habitat. So if we focus in on pictures A and D, these are good illustrations of how large cats use their habitat. So if we take the Canadian lynx as an example, when the female lynx are caring for the young, they have small established territories like that shown in illustration A. Rarely do these territories overlap, and the reason for this is, of course, the protection of their young, as well as providing good habitat with the best food resources available so that their offspring can grow and move on to create their own and establish their own territories. Whereas, on the other hand, a male and juvenile lynx, they're a bit more nomadic in their movements, and they'll cover an area 3 times the size of that of the females, and it'll overlap with multiple females and other males. And the reason for this would be it has more reproductive advantages in which they're more likely to encounter a female. So if we focus in on illustrations B and C from the picture, the diagram, this is an example of migratory behavior. Very typical of birds and large herbivorous animals like caribou and elephants. Migratory animals are essentially following food and water resources. The second fundamental aspect of wildlife ecology is population dynamics. This is the assessment of species growth and regulation. It can also include disease control and monitoring, as well as predation as a way to control populations. Typically, these population dynamics are shown in trend graphs, similar to the example I have here, which are the results from the State of Canada's Birds report. And then the third wildlife interactions, and that's with each other or with other species. And this is usually a competition for space and resources. And it can also include parasitic and symbiotic interactions. So one example of species interaction is niche partitioning. A niche is a communal area in which a species has evolved some morphological or behavioral adaptation to their environment, and it's usually associated with food resources. Niche partitioning is a subtle adaptation of many species that optimize the use of that space in their environment and use the area without too much competition such that it has a disadvantage to their life cycle. So the example I have here is showing 5 different species that could potentially occupy a single tree based on the height of the tree and their spatial location within the tree with which the birds prefer to feed. So this leads to wildlife management and conservation. In the past, as game and non-game species declined, stewardship became a much more prominent aspect to wildlife ecology, and stewardship just simply means looking after a population. Up until about 30 years ago, management and conservation dealt primarily with animals that were hunted for sport. So this has since expanded to include the conservation and protection of endangered species and their habitat. So why do we want to monitor these populations? Well, for game species, it is important to monitor their populations so we're not over-harvesting an animal so that it becomes a species at risk. But we also want to maintain those traditions of hunting. We also feel it's very important to conserve severely declining species and monitor their populations. This will allow us to determine important species at risk habitat so that we can work towards protecting that habitat as well as recovering the species. Population monitoring also allows us to predict changes in the environment. So for example, salmon require pristine, cold, and highly oxygenated streams for spawning. If we notice a decline in salmon populations in a stream, we may be able to attribute that to their decline in a warming waterway or reduced oxygen in the water as a result of increased inputs, nutrient inputs, or there may be increased pollution in the stream, reducing the water quality. All of these examples lead to conservation actions that help protect wildlife and their habitat. So in order to assess wildlife populations, there are kind of standard techniques for determining population numbers. Two survey types that are used for establishing populations are passive and active surveys. So a passive survey refers to remaining unobstructed from a study species behavior so that your presence has little to no influence on their behavior. An example of a passive sampling method are point count surveys or using camera traps to determine if an area is occupied by a certain species, and I'll discuss these two methods a little bit in more detail shortly. On the other hand, an active method usually involves trapping an individual to outfit it with some type of marking so that it can be followed directly or indirectly. Examples of these include bird banding or satellite and GPS tagging and telemetry and collaring. So the first wildlife monitoring technique I'd like to talk about are count surveys. These are used strictly to determine population estimates or occurrences of a species or many species, depending on the target objective of the research. So then two of the most common types of count surveys are point count surveys and aerial surveys. Both methods require a high level of expertise, especially when it comes to birds. So point counts are based on space and time. A person conducting a point count is usually required to identify all birds by sight and sound, as well as they are able to accurately estimate the distance and the direction from which they seen or heard the bird. Timing is also important as birds are most active at sunrise, so for a point count to be most effective, it has to take place first thing in the morning. Multiple points are set up, are established in an area at suitable distance apart, so as you're not counting the same bird twice. A typical point count lasts anywhere from 6 to 10 minutes, and during that time, the observer is writing down all of the birds that they see and hear. Point counts can also be stationary in the sense that the person is not moving from one point to another. So for example, a protocol I was involved with was counting eider ducks during their migration in Alaska. We had a perch set up and counted ducks as they flew by us. Now, not all birds may be detected, but an appropriate method should allow for a good representation of the population. The overall goal of point counts is that they remain standard so that you can determine an abundance of birds, and this information can then be used to track population changes over time. So short-term results allow us to track and monitor species at risk populations. So when it comes to a species at risk, nuances in population numbers are important to monitor so that we can move on making decisions if the species is declining quickly. We also want to know the best estimate of population numbers so that conservation recommendations can be made for protecting the species. Here we have an example of point count results for a short-term population study on cerulean warblers, a small endangered warbler in Canada. This graph is looking at density of cerulean warblers in the study area. The average number shown by the straight horizontal line determined the density of about 0.23 cerulean warbler males per survey area, or 1 male every 4.3 hectares. So now we can assume suitable habitat throughout the study area, and we can extrapolate that number to the total study area to get an abundance estimates of males by multiplying that number 0.23 by the total area surveyed, and that works out to about 690 cerulean males within suitable habitat in the study area. So on the other hand, more common species, long-term population trends would be more suitable. So this graph represents point counts for rose-breasted grosbeak sourced from the breeding bird survey data. This survey this survey is shown here dates back to 1970 and shows an unfortunate trend among many common birds, which is the decline in rose-breasted grosbeaks since surveys began. In fact, grosbeaks are showing a 60% decline since 1970. So long-term population monitoring allows us to be proactive in an attempt to reverse downward trends as well as monitor trends that are a bit more stable. So aerial surveys are another form of count surveys. The surveyor must be able to accurately identify the target species while flying in a plane or helicopter, as well as estimate large number of mixed groups of animals such as caribou herds, groups of fish, or flocks of birds. The person must also not be prone to motion sickness, because flying in a plane with the smell of gasoline for an entire day is not for a person with a weak stomach. So their design for ducks involve flying in transects in a plane or a helicopter in a similar manner to the image on the left here. When you come across a large flock of ducks, you begin counting, but you're not counting each duck individually. You're estimating the number of ducks, and that's based on the density of the flock. So estimating numbers of the flock can easily be trained. The difficult part is having to identify the birds and count at the same time as you're passing by. So I think one of the most extensive aerial surveys for waterfowl is conducted by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and covers the vast majority of the waterfowl breeding area in North America. They provide population estimates not only on total ducks, but also population estimates of individual species as well. These surveys go directly into managing ducks for hunting. As you can see, the number of ducks recently has been increasing. And the reason for this is hunters are probably the biggest supporters of wildlife conservation, especially when it comes to waterfowl. It also speaks to the strength that if we work to conserve and protect habitat regardless of our priorities, we can have a positive influence on our environment. So the first integrative technology making its way into wildlife research I'd like to talk about is the use of drones. They are in their first decade, and they have the potential to provide us with increased data accuracy, and in my opinion has been substantial in moving us towards a better conservation and management practices. Drones have the potential of improving our understanding of habitat management for most study species. They can provide more accurate population estimates and provide substantial information in wildlife interaction research. They can easily integrate into our traditional survey methods and also provide an effective and inexpensive way to monitor populations. So if we were to look back at that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey, waterfowl area survey, and think of the benefits that drones would have on a survey as extensive as this, there are three limiting factors when it comes to wildlife research, and those are time, accessibility, and money. Drones could substantially alleviate all of those limiting factors. So as we increase our wireless network as well, a flight trip could be coded into the drone to complete the transects. It would be released and returned, and the data downloaded in real time. As recognition software becomes more advanced, error in identifying species and counting would be greatly reduced, and that would only strengthen our conservation and management decisions for all of these species. Other than population estimates, another impact drones could have on is habitat selection and use, as well as habitat identification. The 360-degree camera with multispectral imagery on a drone can give us accurate three-dimensional images of an animal's habitat, especially important for animals like birds who spend most of their time at the top of the trees. And so the example I'm showing here is what's called a digital elevation model, and that has been used to map fish habitat, and it gives detailed information on the watershed, including important elevation information such as the slope and water depth. So so they also have the ability to be connected to an individual and follow them around, and this could increase the amount of time and data collected with minimal disturbance and at minimal cost. So in this bird's eye view, you can clearly make out a pair of mallards swimming around undisturbed by the drone. The information could be gathered is incredibly important for behavioral research. So you could pose questions such as how do males and females interact with each other? From this point of view, we can accurately answer questions like what is the largest distance and how long they stay separated, or what cues do the males and females use to return to each other. As with all new technology, there are some drawbacks, and the same can be said for drones. First, drones are great for open spaces and large wildlife, but unfortunately not so great for forest cover and smaller wildlife. A potential solution is photographing in thermal and infrared to count hidden species, but that is definitely used for vegetation, and it's definitely used for vegetation surveys, but doesn't really help with identifying individual species under cover. So also, the improper use of a drone and some of the drone development needs to take wildlife disturbance into account when they are being developed. However, a low-flying plane or a helicopter is certainly more of a disturbance than a drone would be. On top of wildlife research permits, the permit process that allows you to fly a drone is quite comprehensive and can take months to be approved. You are required to follow airspace traffic regulations, similar to if you were a pilot flying a helicopter. So the flight plan has to be communicated, as well as a good reason for the and the intent of the research and why you would want to use a drone to complete that research. So most importantly, the technology is still a ways off from where ecologists would like to see it. So because they are relatively new, there are some sampling and analytical methods may not be as good as our traditional methods. Species identification is the most important aspect to wildlife ecology. You can't identify your wildlife, you can't conserve and manage wildlife, so pattern recognition technology would be a huge leap forward in using this technology for ecologists. Because of the lack of pattern recognition, this means we can't effectively measure biodiversity in an area using drones. As I've shown, drones, they have the great potential to map habitat for wildlife, but cannot alone determine if habitat may be suitable for reintroduction or identifying habitat for species at risk. So the next technique I'd like to talk about is bird banding and tracking birds. This technique is a useful method for determining population trends through time, and especially important for understanding bird migration ecology. So we have been banding birds since the early 1900s. The actual process for capturing birds using nets has gone back much further. It usually takes place around migration, and the process of capturing and banding is pretty simple. A fine mesh net is set up on a linear trail or in an open space similar to the image here on the left. There are many other traps used, but mist nets are the most common. So what happens is a bird will fly into the net, it falls into this pouch and gets tangled up. Some careful hands remove the bird, and it's brought back to a station for banding and measuring. The individual will receive a band on their leg, and it has a unique 9-digit identification number, and it's attributed to that individual only. They'll determine age and sex of the bird and take some physiological measurements such as wing length and the amount of fat. The bird is then released and continue on its way during migration. So since we are collecting that information during migration, we can determine numerous indices of behavior and population. So from bird banding data, we've determined that some birds arrive earlier than others. So if we pair that information with weather data we could determine if birds are arriving earlier or leaving later, and that would indicate a change in their migration behavior. Birds often get recaptured in other nets during migration, so now we know how far they have gone as well as roughly how long it took them to get there. We can also establish population indices for individual species based on the number of birds that were captured in a given year. So in the case of the northern parula here, captured at Long Point Bird Observatory since 1980, we have noticed an increase in their spring numbers by 10 to 15%. So what this indices is indicating is that the northern parula are surviving their migration south in the fall and back north in the spring, and that their wintering habitat is likely to be remaining intact. So a technology especially important to bird migration ecology are satellite transmitters. Although it's not necessarily a new technology, satellite transmitters have been around since the early 1990s. What is newer is their increased capabilities as well as their size and weight reduction, which will continue to decrease as the technology advances. So they are a very accurate technology. It allows for wildlife to be tracked and followed. They come in various forms, including collars and tags, which depends on the application. So a collar would be applied to a larger wildlife, such as wolves, deer, and moose, whereas tags, like the ones shown here, are typically applied to larger birds. The most important factor about these transmitters is the weight ratio to the animal. A transmitter should not exceed about 1% of the individual's weight, and the reason being is that a transmitter too large has a deleterious effect on the animal's health. If the transmitter is causing the animal to behave unnaturally, the quality of the data that will be collected will be unsuitable to make management and conservation decisions. The weight of the transmitter becomes ever more important the smaller the animal gets. So these transmitters are equipped with GPS technology. They're battery or solar powered and can be attached to the animal, or they can be implanted subcutaneously. The advantages of these transmitters is that it relays information at whatever time interval the researcher is interested in based on the question they are asking. Most of the time with satellite transmitters, that question has to do with migration, either to the wintering grounds or to the breeding grounds. They are also interested in what path the birds are taking, as well as where they are stopping to rest and refuel. So as an example, here, looking at some satellite transmitter data taken on black scoters by the Sea Duck Joint Venture, the map on the right shows black scoters in blue, and every blue point on that map indicates a moment when the transmitter sent a signal to the researcher. The information sent is typically the date, the time, and the location of the individual. And there are also options to have weather data as well, but again, that depends on the researcher's questions. The map on the right connects those dots and highlights the fall migration pathway for all the black scoters that were tagged in this research. As you can see, it provides a very detailed picture of the pathway taken by black scoters from northern Canada all the way to the southeastern United States. Since this information produces very accurate locations of the birds throughout their migration, it can be used to provide important information on travel corridors as well as as well as identify important habitat for conservation measures. On the other hand, the MODIS wildlife tracking is a relatively newer tracking technology. It began in 2012. It requires an infrastructure of an array of semi-permanent tower stations, and there are currently over 600 stations in 27 countries in the Western Hemisphere. The wildlife are typically captured and equipped with a very small, lightweight transmitter. Because of the size and the weight of the transmitter and the versatility is probably its most valuable asset, as it can be attached to the smaller wildlife, including insects, bats, and birds. So in this video, we have two birds in the same family as the robin. They are the Swainson's thrush here in orange and the gray-cheeked thrush in gray, being tracked during the spring migration under the MODIS array. The results show the direct pathway taken by individual birds as they move north. The array just fills in the gaps on the migratory behavior across the Americas, and then we can focus our conservation efforts not just on larger birds, but all migratory animals. So one of my favorite population monitoring techniques is nest searching and monitoring. The reason it is one of my favorites is because of the patience it requires and the behavioral nuances you have to pay attention to find a nest. It's very exciting to find a nest. You spend an hour or more, 2 hours sometimes, watching one bird. So for me, the equivalent of finding a nest is like solving a mystery or winning a scavenger hunt. So it's very simple, but it's time-consuming. For some species, it's very easy to find a nest. For others, it's extremely difficult. The pictures here show two different defense mechanisms birds use to protect their nest and young. The yellow-billed loon on the left is trying to make themselves inconspicuous by bowing down, and Canada geese do the same behavior. The American golden plover on the right is pretending to have an injured wing. And it's hoping that the predator will come after the adult and move away from the nest to protect the young. So once a nest is found, you have to monitor the nest for every 3 to 5 days to determine the activity there. A telescopic pole with a convex mirror attached to the end is used to peer into the nest and count the number of eggs or young. Monitoring will continue like this until the nest is complete, which means either the young have flown away or the nest has been predated. So the information that comes from nest search or from nest monitoring is productivity. Productivity is a population measurement that determines if a species are producing enough offspring in a given year to increase their dispersal and distribution across suitable habitat to maintain or grow their population. So for species at risk, knowing how productive they are is very important. If a species are not producing young, it makes it very hard to recover that species. So here's an example of how we use productivity in wildlife ecology. This is an example from some research we do at Birds Canada for 4 species at risk. Nests have been monitored for 3 of these 4 species in southern Ontario since 2011. Those species are the prothonotary warbler, the Louisiana water thrush, and the Acadian flycatcher. For prothonotary warblers, I don't worry too much about the downward trend of their productivity because their productivity averages around 4 young per nest per year, 4 successful young per nest per year. And the count surveys that we do on top of the nest monitoring are also proving that their numbers appear to be moving slowly upwards. However, my concern lies more with the other 2 birds, and especially the Acadian flycatcher. So for the Louisiana water thrush, there are fluctuations in their productivity, and those fluctuations and the downward trend is reflecting in their occupancy within their range in southern Ontario, as we don't seem to be detecting them as often as we have in the past. in 2019, we did see a very productive year for Louisiana water thrush, and hopefully that will carry over into next year when we continue to search for them. The Acadian flycatcher productivity is troubling for a couple reasons. First, because it's so low. We only have an average of about one successful young per nest per year. And two, they are showing a downward trend with an already low productivity. So ideally, in order to maintain or grow a population, we would want that average productivity to be about 1.5 to 2 young per nest per year. So some advancements for nest monitoring have been camera traps, and especially those that include video. On top of this, some of the cameras capable of live streaming directly to a web page, which the nest can be monitored. So in this video here, we see a Canada goose, and she's turning over some eggs while one of her young are poking her head out from underneath her. There are many advantages to these passive video traps in behavioral research, as well as monitoring populations. So for mammal trapping, I'd like to speak about passive and active mammal trapping and the importance of both. So passive trapping is an excellent way to gather data on animal occupancy without stressing the animal. However, there are cases where active trapping is necessary, such as disease control. And I'll talk a bit about both of these methods, as well as some of the technology used on mammals to track their movements. So there are two main types of small mammal live traps. The first are Sherman traps, usually reserved for very small mammals like mice, voles, chipmunks, and squirrels. And the second are called tomahawk traps, and they are used for medium-sized animals such as raccoons, skunks, and foxes. Trapping small mammals like mice are often used for prey abundance estimates, which refers back to two fundamental areas of wildlife ecology, which are population dynamics and wildlife interactions. So this type of research may be used alongside of camera trap occupancy data, which is another form of population surveying I will speak about in a moment. But essentially, researchers will want to know if the density of prey in a study area is sustainable for the population of predators occupying the area. Trapping small mammals another aspect of mammal trapping that is currently taking place in Ontario is the rabies program conducted by the Ministry of Natural Resources. So they use two sides of tomahawk live traps that are baited with sardines to capture raccoons and skunks so they can be vaccinated. Once that animal is captured, it's injected with the rabies vaccine and released at the site it was trapped. This is a photo more to do with me releasing an animal. It is a possum, not a raccoon or a skunk. So possums just get released when they get trapped because they are incapable of contracting the rabies virus. Large mammal live traps are usually constructed similar to the trap here on the left. This trap here was specifically constructed for lynx from PVC pipe and mesh. It can be baited with squirrel or hare, but lynx are also attracted to shiny objects, so often mirrors or tinfoil hanging from the trap is enough to attract them. The wooden door is set up to a tripwire. When the lynx enter the trap, they trip the wire, the door closes behind them, and these traps are usually checked at least twice a day. So in order to handle large mammals, once it's trapped, it has to be put under with an anesthetic. This is where the specialty of this research comes in. The person administering the anesthetic has been certified by a veterinarian in animal handling, chemical immobilization, and animal welfare courses. Depending on the research question, measurements of the animal will be taken, blood will be drawn for DNA analysis, and the animal will be fitted with a satellite transmitter collar. So just like with the birds satellite transmitter, it is very similar, except that it's attached like a collar, like a pet, and the animal's location is downloaded and it's tracked over a period of time. So I have an example of some research that was done in Yellowstone Park, tracking the movement of a male lynx. If you recall, I said that males can be a little bit nomadic in their movements. So this is an example of a male that's explored areas outside its normal territory range. So we have its territory is down here, this dark oblong circle, but you can see it's moved north and back south again, just exploring the area. So camera traps are a good passive way to collect occupancy information on wildlife, and they work using a sensor trigger. So when that sensor has been broken, the camera will take a number of quick successional photos of whatever tripped the sensor. Although you don't get the accurate, detailed information a satellite transmitter might, it is a cheaper and effective method used in population studies. So the standard method used for this technology is setting the camera traps up in a grid-like pattern. The separation between the cameras will depend on the study subject. So if you're studying an animal with a smaller territory or home range, you would set the cameras a little closer together. Whereas animals with larger territories, you would set them further apart. And you would determine that based on previous research and knowledge of the animal that the researcher has done. So the goal of setting up the camera traps in this grid-like pattern is to capture an individual in multiple cameras. And this is a study method referred to as mark recapture, and that would allow you to get an idea of population density within the study area. So I've gone over some of the methods used by researchers to solve problems about wildlife ecology. You don't need to be a researcher to get involved with scientific research projects. There are two apps in particular that are proving especially important for wildlife and biodiversity research. And those two apps I'm referring to are iNaturalist and eBird. These apps are global networks for science and research to document wildlife. eBird is specific to birds around the world, whereas iNaturalist covers the biodiversity of Earth. I'll focus on iNaturalist for this webinar because it is the app I'm most familiar with, and it focuses on biodiversity, which covers the entire gamut of species around the world. Both of these apps are free, and they're an open source data platform. So their overall purpose are similar in that you record your observation, it's represented in a list of observations that the user has created, and then can be accessed by researchers looking for data. So both apps allow you to, so the information, excuse me. So once you've created a profile, users have a dashboard and a similar layout to any social media platform where people can follow you or you can follow other people. Experts are commenting on your identifications. There is a forum that can be, there's a forum so you can be involved with iNaturalist conversations, and of course an option to add your observations. So both apps, so the iNaturalist app allows you to keep records of your observations while you're on a hike or you're camping or anywhere outdoors or indoors for that matter, and you come across an insect, a plant, or an animal, and you're curious to know what it is or to learn more about it. So iNaturalist uses a recognition software that provides visually similar suggestions to the correct ID. So every time I request an ID for a species, I'm incredibly impressed with iNaturalist recognition software and algorithm. It is quite accurate, especially when you have a good photo. So once you've identified your species, it provides a description so that the users can learn about the species you're identifying, and it also provides a global distribution based on other iNaturalist observations. It also provides a link to Wikipedia where you can learn more about the species that you're identifying, as well as commonly misidentified species maybe correct your identification, or if you are interested in a certain species and want to know more about similar species. The information that you put in iNaturalist is submitted by and overviewed by experts, and they provide a confirmation or a correction to your identification. The data that's submitted can be used for population research, migration ecology, or habitat selection and use. And then researchers can use that to make conservation and management decisions that affect species at risk or other wildlife. So there's also advantages. There are also other advantages. You can create and develop your own research project with iNaturalist. The website is quite powerful in that you can create these projects like this one here. The smartphone app is also very good for if you're trying to identify species while you're on the move, walking down the street, or you're working in the field. So now I'd like to move to some of the work that we do to protect and improve habitat species at risk at Birds Canada. We are currently working on creating best management practices for cerulean warblers with the intention to recover the species against habitat loss. So the cerulean warbler is a small wood warbler in southern Ontario. There is estimated to be about 500 pairs of cerulean warblers in Canada. 98% of the population occurs in Ontario. There are two populations in Ontario, one in the eastern portion of the province and another in the southwest. And the reason we have two populations is because they have been dissected by human development. Along with urban development and the loss of the remaining preferred habitat, their population has declined by 70% between 1970 and 2017, and that is one of the steepest decline of any wood warblers in North America. Cerulean warblers are interior forest birds that like mature deciduous trees with tall, mature deciduous forests with tall, well-spaced trees, and they are very sensitive to the removal of these trees. Males sing from trees within their territories called song posts at or near an opening in the canopy. And it's these habitat features that we are measuring in depth to try to determine the best management practice for these birds. So there are a number of forest elements that we need to measure in order to make proper management plans for cerulean warblers. Some of the forest measurements we include when we locate a cerulean warbler are a tree height, the forest composition, the number and the diameter of the trees around the cerulean warbler, as well as canopy cover measurements. So once we have that data, we will analyze the habitat features that are most important for cerulean warblers. And so from our results, we can see that sugar maple and red oak trees are important for cerulean warbler, as well as the total number of trees. So there are other forest measurements here that are important, but for the brevity of this webinar, I'll focus on tree species and the number of trees. So let me explain what's going on in this graph, because we'll see it a couple more times. So the vertical axis here is showing the predicted expectations of ceruleans to occupy an area. And ideally, we would want to see a predicted expectation or occupancy above 60%, which is represented by the red horizontal line here. Each dot on the graph here, it's represented by a predicted cerulean warbler itself. And then we have the horizontal axis down here, which represents the diameter or size of the tree and that's been reduced into a tree size class, which is represented in this blue box. The green box up here indicates the majority of cerulean warbler occupancy above this 60% threshold. And then the S-curve here is just telling me that this is where cerulean warblers respond positively to sugar maples. And so based on this graph from our results, we can see that cerulean warblers have a class size range between 2 and 17, 15 sugar maple here, so about 17. And since we know that based on research, we know that cerulean warblers do not prefer undergrowth, so we can remove saplings from this analysis in order to prescribe our management plan. So again, if we refer more to this tree classification chart, we can have up to 8 polewood-sized trees, 5 medium-sized or 4 extra large-sized trees, or we could have a mixture of all of these sizes here, as long as we're not exceeding that 17 total size classes. And that's where we start. That's where it starts to dip down here with the S-line curve, and we see this decline in cerulean warbler occupancy. So similarly with our red oaks, again, we have this cerulean warbler occupancy is highest between 2 and about 25 here. So if we refer to our tree classification chart again, we can have 12 polewood-sized trees, 8 medium or 6 extra large, and again, a mix of those as long as we're not exceeding that 25 total size classes. Now that we know what type of trees are important for cerulean warblers, another important aspect to consider is the total number of trees. So in this case, we have a range of 30 to 52 total size classes of trees where we have this high cerulean warbler presence. So to recap, we have 2 to 17 size class sugar maples, 2 to 25 red oaks, and 30 to 52 total size class of all trees. So the difficult part now is finding a forest prescription range for cerulean warblers that falls within the metrics that we have determined. So a forest prescription is a term used by the forestry industry, and it's used to prescribe which trees to cut and which to retain. A forestry prescription is described in ratios of tree species. So from our analysis, we can see that red oak are somewhat more important for cerulean warblers than sugar maple, or they're more abundant for cerulean warblers than sugar maple, and we can see that the ratio is about 1.5 to 1. So ideally, we would be looking for a forest prescription that is 3 red oak to 2 sugar maples. Another way to say this is that we have a forest composition of 30% of red oak or 20% sugar maple. So Birds Canada would then propose that a forest prescription similar to this must be maintained in order to protect cerulean warbler habitat and increase their potential for recovery. So once we have established these BMPs, the next is to implement them. So first, we would need to identify sites that are suitable for cerulean warblers, and that is where our point count surveys come in that I mentioned earlier. Once we've identified those sites, then how do we arrange to have those BMPs implemented? So in this case, partnerships with landowners and managers is especially important. And one thing Birds Canada is really good at is building and maintaining relationships. And so we hope to build on that and implement those BMPs based on these good working relationships. The other thing we want to know is how well are these BMPs going to work for this species, and we really have no idea unless we try, and again, that's kind of where our relationship with the landowner comes in. So that's what we would want to find out is once they're implemented, once we've developed them and implemented them, are they effective, and if not, why not? So in that case, we would need to continue monitoring those sites so that we can adaptively manage for cerulean warbler BMPs. So in this case, adaptive management refers to altering our best management practices for any inconsistencies or unnecessary implementations, and it'd be sort of like fine-tuning the BMP so that they're most effective for cerulean warblers as well as forest and woodlot health. So this is how we conserve and manage and work together with landowners. The overall goal for all parties should be to have long-term sustainable and diverse populations of wildlife, as well as sustainable and diverse forest ecosystems as well. So thank you for listening. I appreciate your patience at the beginning as well as your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to take my email address. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And if you have any questions for me now, I'd be happy to take them if we have time.
Wow, thank you very much, Ian, for that. That was amazing. We have so much great comments and questions that I'd like to address right now.
Okay.
Before I go ahead and do that, I just want to apologize in advance if I don't get all of the questions. There's quite a few here. And also, I apologize if any of the questions that I addressed, they've already been answered. I tried to listen in and jot down questions at the same time, but I might have missed a few things. So let's get started on the Q&A. So the first question goes back to the beginning of your presentation when you're talking about the different types of surveys for bird monitoring. Somebody asked how accurate are surveys, particularly the point count surveys.
How accurate are the surveys? So in terms of species identification, obviously the longer you survey, the more likely you're to encounter or determine how many species are there. However, time is always an issue, so you try to maximize your time as best as you can. Now, when you're looking at, I mentioned in the presentation that the point count surveys are about 6 to 10 minutes. So we do a surveys for cerulean warblers that is 6 minutes long. So for that survey in particular, we had done some analyses on our point counts to determine what was the minimal amount of time we had to spend at a point count to determine to increase our detection rate of cerulean warblers. And we found that we could spend as little time as 6 minutes, which increased the number of point counts we can do, right? So if you reduce the number of time, if you reduce the number of time of point counts, you can increase the number of time you spend in the field doing more point counts. Whereas the example I'm showing here on the presentation, it was more for biodiversity. So we want to spend, so that's more of a 10-minute point count where we'll spend 10 minutes and try to detect. In terms of accuracy, that's where the expertise of the individual comes in to do the point counts. That person really needs to know how to identify birds by their song and as well as sight. I think the subjective part about the accuracy is when you're trying to measure distances when you're just listening for birds. And so you're trying to determine, in the diagram here, those circles are actually represent, so the center would be the observer. The first line is 50 meters out, the second line is 100 meters out, and then anything beyond that. So as you get further and further out, your detection rate or your ability to identify an individual bird or birds is greatly reduced. But you have, I'm getting too much into analysis now, but you have error rates that you consider when you're doing your analysis.
Okay. So the next question jumps to aerial surveying. The question is, what animals can you use? What sort of animals or wildlife do you track using aerial surveying?
Aerial surveys are usually tracked. So a lot of the times aerial surveys are done for game animals, so animals that are hunted. Usually The reason they do aerial surveys is because they are trying to cover as much ground as possible in as little time as possible. So aerial surveys are used extensively for ducks. I mean, that's pretty much some of the only, they do some point counts for surveys, but I mean, the major survey is the one that I had shown here with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But there are, the Ministry of Natural Resources does moose surveys through the air. They do wolf surveys in the air. And as you go further north, they're doing caribou surveys by the air. So it's typically a game species that get aerial surveys conducted. Most of the money goes into game from hunters and for hunting. So it's very expensive to complete these aerial surveys. So that's where the money is, and that's what they do there.
Okay. So the next question is about the drones. So there are a lot of questions about the drones. Some people wanted to know, air wildlife, are they dangerous? Is it expensive? So could you give us a background information about drones, and are there specific types of drones that are used for wildlife monitoring?
Yeah, so, okay, it's a loaded question.
Yeah, sure.
I imagine there was a lot of questions for that because it's a new technology and an interesting technology.
Yeah.
So the two types of drones that are used here, so the remote control style drone that is kind of typical, the one that's used on the left, it can be used in multiple applications, especially because of the size of it. It can move. I like the idea of using it in the forest because of the size of them. And they're a little bit easier to maneuver. I'm hoping I'm answering questions. So I like those drones for those types of surveys. The plane style drone is usually used for more open spaces and larger areas. Again, like I had mentioned as an example, it would be perfect for those waterfowl surveys that cover almost the entire North America landscape. So it's good for those kinds of things, whereas the smaller drone, handheld drone, it could be used much better for a little bit more localized questions and questions for wildlife ecology. What else am I missing? Because I know there was a lot in there.
I think you covered everything. I guess the next thing would be they scare some wildlife, and do you find that you use them for certain species and then others you can't?
Yeah, so I've never seen where they have caused a disturbance. So one thing I do know is birds are affected by them, especially because they're flying through the air. So birds are scared up by them. The other thing is small birds that sit on the ground, or small birds in general, no matter where they reside, anything that's flying over top of them can be seen as a predator. And so a lot of people, there's a lot of concern for that type of disturbance, and that you're actually creating a stressful predation event on the birds that you're studying, right? So it definitely has that, I guess we'll say, negative aspect to it. How that can be alleviated, I don't know, because I mean, you're talking about flying up above and through animals' habitat and territory. So how that will be alleviated will be up to the people that use them in the future, and what effect that might have on the birds or other life.
Okay, almost done here.
Sure.
So next question is regarding bird banding. What are some negative drawbacks to bird banding, and can it disrupt natural patterns of migration? Some potential. Of course, handling any animal, it has some drawbacks. You are stressing that animal out. There is a term in wildlife ecology when you're trapping
and handling animals called capture myopathy. And basically what that is you put, an animal has been put into a stressful situation to the point where it's gone, it becomes almost, what's the best way to explain it? It's paralyzed in a sense, and that it stops moving, and the recovery rate from capture myopathy is very low. That said, when we're banding birds, the chances of that to happen is very slim. I've banded numerous birds, I've banded numerous wildlife, and thousands of individuals, and I've only ever seen capture myopathy once, and that was in a mouse. They're especially sensitive because they already have this quick heart rate, and so any type of adrenaline and any type of adrenaline like that could increase their chances for that. In terms of affecting their migration, not very much. Like, the bands are so tiny, they're aluminum, they're extremely lightweight, and so it has very little influence on their migration, as well as the handling time is so small. Like, we're talking a good bander and a good recorder. You can see in the picture here, the 4 individuals, there's one person banding, one person observing, and another person recording. And that's kind of usually how a banding station works. And so the timing of handling that animal is probably a minute at most. So it's very little time handling. Satellite transmitters pose a different problem. As I said, the weight ratio to the animal is probably its most crucial, because you don't want to have that negative effect on their health.
Okay. So there's a few more questions. However, we are running out of time, and it looks like some people are logging off. So I think I'm going to stop it there. But as you mentioned, if somebody does have a question that wasn't addressed, you can always email Ian.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so thank you so much for doing that presentation and for answering all those questions. And thank you for everyone who joined in and listened and participated. It was a great webinar. I learned quite a few things, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd like to just end this session. But yeah, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Everybody, thank you for listening.